Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional and coach from California, USA, Mr. Rusty Gaillard. Rusty, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Rusty is an executive coach. He joined Apple before the iPhone was launched and worked with Apple for 14 years before starting his coaching business. So, Rusty, before we speak about coaching, tell me about your own journey and what was the motivation to leave such a successful career in Apple?
I have what I call a very traditional corporate background up until becoming a coach. I worked at General Electric out of college and went back for business school and then found my way to Apple. So worked at very large corporations. And during my 14 years at Apple, I loved it. I think Apple's a great company.
Absolutely.
And I enjoyed working there. I love the people. And a lot of people looked at me a little bit like I was crazy when I told them I was leaving. And my reason for leaving really was I had come to this point in my life where I had changed the way I operated at work. I grew up in the kind of family that didn't think about challenges or feelings or difficulties. It was just a go get it done kind of family. And through some personal things going on in my life, I had actually had to find a way to learn how to talk about the difficulties and the challenges of my life in order to navigate these personal challenges. And what I realized during that was how valuable it is to be able to talk about your experience, to be able to have somebody you trust who can help you see things differently, who can support you in navigating a change.
Amazing.
And it was really taking that capacity and bringing it back into the professional world that motivated me to leave and become a coach.
Wow. And you also are a rocket scientist and an MBA from Stanford. How did this influence what you were doing before you started coaching, and then how did this influence your coaching business?
Yeah, I was a rocket scientist and in college. And I think that the two things that I take about that influence my coaching business is one is be ambitious in your goals. And you think about what space exploration is all about, ambition and trying things that have never been done before.
Absolutely.
And I think too many of us don't think that way. And so bringing that kind of mindset of think ambitiously. But the flip side of that is pay attention to the details and figure out what are the steps you need to take to deliver on that. Because there's some people who are very philosophical in their coaching, and I love the philosophy, but it has to become practical. It has to be actionable. And so to me, it's this very ambitious kind of big thinking coupled with tangible action that comes from my engineering and rocket science background that I bring into the coaching world.
Wow, what a great response. Thank you. So let's talk coaching now, Rusty. Can you explain your own coaching philosophy and how it differs from a conventional coaching methodology that a lot of people use?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. Number one is I'm very much big on the big goal, right? Being ambitious and thinking big. And because of that, it requires a lot of courage in the people that I work with. So my own personal example, which I'll use, is the decision to leave Apple, which again, many people said, why would you ever do that? It's a great company. You have a great job. You've been there for a long time. You're an expert in what you do. And it takes real courage to do something that you believe in that's going to move you forward on your personal journey. So that's one thing. I would say the second thing I do that's different from a lot of people is I help people identify what's in their way of taking action. Right? It's very easy to say, to put this in a personal realm that we can all relate to in some way. It's easy to say, oh, I'm going to start exercising. And we all know there's benefits of doing that, and it's a good thing. And intellectually, we understand. And yet, a lot of people just never get there. They don't start exercising. So rather than say, just hold them accountable, which is a lot of coaches hold people accountable, I say, well, that's great. But if it's truly important to you, what's in the way? Why is this not happening? And so looking at the barriers, understanding those and helping to shift them so you can work through it and achieve your goals.
Well said. You do a lot of work with the leaders, Rusty. And before I ask you questions on how you help them, I want to ask you, what are some of the common ways you have seen corporate norms stifle leadership potential?
a, a lot of people are stifled in their leadership potential by corporate
Absolutely.
norms.
Mm.
And it comes down to this belief that a lot of people that they have to fit into these corporate norms.
Mm.
Which tend to be, especially in large corporations, to fit in, to follow the culture, to do what's expected of you, not to make mistakes, to get the right answer, to look smart when you're showing up in front of somebody. It's all of these kinds of assumptions that we have about the way we need to look. And I will tell you that early in my career, I used to think of myself literally as my home personality and my professional personality, as if I were two different people. Because the professional personality wasn't allowed to talk about the crazy things I did on the weekend or the adventures I had or any of those things. It was really buttoned up, very impersonal, risk averse, trying to be smart, trying to look good. And that kind of norm really gets in the way, because what makes people successful these days is bringing their best ideas and the best of themselves.
Well said. Well said. And how do you help leaders challenge and change the status quo within their organizations?
Yeah. So it starts with my bias, and one of my biases is responsibility. So many people will say, well, if only the environment were different, or if I were in a better company, or if my boss had a different way of interacting. And that's nice. You can want to change the environment, but you got to start with yourself. So I'm very strongly biased towards what are the things that you can do differently in order to make a difference. Two other points of bias that I have. One is towards candor. So many people will say something to me, well, this is what I really think about my boss. And my question back is, have you told your boss that? So it's finding this way to actually express what it is that you're thinking. And the third bias that I'll share is towards experimenting, trying something different. Too many people just say, well, it's not changing, but they're not trying anything differently. So it's this willingness to actually do an experiment, try something, gather some data, and then either do more of it or change course.
Everything that you're saying seems so simple, and yet almost nobody implements. When you just mentioned that try something different, I don't think too many people have the courage to try something different. And thank you for all the work that you're doing with people who will make a difference.
Yeah, and fundamentally, the work that I do and the work that I help my clients with is very simple, but it's not easy.
Absolutely, very well.
And there's a lot of resistance to it.
I agree.
And that's really where what I do is different, because I can share these simple ideas. I'm sure many of your listeners have heard these simple ideas.
Absolutely.
The question is, where's the resistance, and why aren't you doing it? How do we uncover that so we can change it and free you to move forward?
Absolutely. And that's the reason I intervened, to say that it sounds simple, but if people who are viewing and listening to our conversation actually implement it, it can be game changing and life changing. But my next question for you, Rusty, is, can you give us a specific example, without any names, of course, where you helped a leader create more impact without changing jobs?
Yeah. I'll give you an example of a client. I'm going to just refer to him as Steve for the sake of simplicity. But Steve worked in a company that was very top down in its culture. It was the kind of company that cultivated obedience, didn't like a lot of pushback. They wanted people to follow directions. And so what I did with Steve is we worked both on behavior and on mindset. Because when you're in that kind of culture, back to like, how do cultural norms stifle people? Well, where you're in an environment that encourages people to keep quiet and follow direction, it's difficult to step forward as a leader. So one of the things that I started to work with Steve on is owning more of the decisions. Prior to this, he was in this mode of going to the boss and saying, here's some different options, and maybe presenting a recommendation, but letting the boss decide. I said, well, how can you shift that? And how can you own more of those decisions and inform your boss, so your boss still is aware of it and has the opportunity to comment, but you're not even asking for a comment. You're not asking for your boss to decide. You're deciding and informing your boss. So it was a mindset shift around who owns that decision, and a behavior change around how to communicate and inform the boss of that decision.
Well said. My next question is, as I was reading about you and preparing for my conversation with you, I was fascinated to notice that you focus on helping high-achieving leaders break from corporate norms. Tell me more about this, and maybe an example will help.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I like to focus on high achievers is because high achievers in particular tend to play by the rules.
Mm.
Now that's is in corporations. Now, of course, there's people who are founders or running a startup, and by nature, they're a little bit more willing to step outside of the lines because they've started their own company. But especially people in large corporations tend to follow the rules because how are you successful earlier in your career? Or even
Mm.
as a student, you're successful by delivering on the assignment that's given to you,
Mm.
whether that's as a student, so you get an A in school, or earlier in your career, when you do very well on what's assigned to you, you
Mm.
get more opportunities. So high achievers in this kind of corporate culture are very much drawn to this mode of performing well on their assignments, not making any mistakes,
Yeah,
sounding good, looking smart.
very interesting.
And it's helping people to break through that
Mm.
is really the goal that I have. So I'm going to go back to this example that I talked about
Okay.
Steve.
Mm.
When I first had this conversation with Steve, he was in this very top-down kind of culture, but he also wasn't happy.
Mm.
He wanted to excel as a leader, he wanted to grow as a leader, he wanted to have a bigger impact on the team and on the company, and he felt stuck in his ability to deliver on that.
Yeah.
And so this came from, in part, this mindset of needing to follow the rules, to follow the corporate norms, to follow the culture, which was very much a top-down culture.
Mm.
So it was he was willing to experiment, to
Mm.
have the courage to try some new things, do something differently.
Mm.
And in doing so, he actually found better impact because he was able to make decisions faster. He was able to own the decisions, which also made him happier. So
Yeah.
he not only delivered better results, but he was happier in the process.
Mm. Great response. And what are some of the indicators? And I'm sure you've come across these many, many times. What are some indicators that a senior leader is ready for coaching?
Two things that came to mind when I think about this. Number one is when someone has plateaued, when they've
Mm.
reached this point where they've been progressing in their career and they're stuck for some reason. They want to keep growing, they want the next level of
Mm.
opportunity, but they're not
Mm.
getting it. So that's one clear indicator that it's time for coaching.
Mm.
And I think many of us have heard the phrase, what got you here will not get you there. And
Correct.
that's classically applied in this kind of situation where you're not advancing in the way you used to or the way you would like to. And it's because you're still doing something the way you used to do it, and it's time to switch into a new way of doing it. So
Mm.
that is a great opportunity for coaching. Another invitation for coaching is if someone is finding themselves bored or burned out, or in some other way just not as engaged in their work as they used to be.
Mm. Amazing.
That is another great opportunity to say it's time to start doing something different
Mm.
so that you can be happier and more engaged. And when you do, of course, you will be more successful.
Well said. You also help clients redefine success beyond title and salary. So my question is, how do you define success?
I'm going to answer that in two ways.
Sure.
Number one is, to some extent, my definition of success is not that important
Mm.
because what matters is my client's definition
Correct.
of success and
Correct.
what matters to them. So
Yeah.
that's the first piece. The second piece is the common theme that I see and I hear from a lot of my clients,
Mm.
and this really resonates with me, is this desire for freedom.
Mm.
The desire to really be the kind of person you want to be,
Mhm.
to show up at work the way you want to show up, to live the kind of life you want to live, which is the balance of work and the rest of your life.
Mm.
Many people talk about wanting the next promotion or the title or the salary or some amount of money in the bank. And
Mhm.
then they say, well, once I reach that, then I can really be the kind of person I want to be.
Mm.
And I really work with people to challenge them and say, how much of that can you pull forward and start to do now?
Right.
Because not only do you get out of this mode of delayed gratification where you have
Mm.
to suffer now in order to have rewards later,
Mm.
you can enjoy the process more.
Mm.
And you might be hearing this as a theme, but when you enjoy the process more, you're more effective at work because
Mm.
you're bringing more of yourself. You're more willing to share your best ideas. You're more relatable. You're a better leader to other
Mm.
people.
Mm.
And that makes you more effective in the workplace as well.
Mm. Very well said. And what role does courage play in the coaching process? And how do you encourage clients to embrace courage?
Courage is everything. And this gets back to the conversation we had earlier of,
Mm.
all the listeners, the people who are listening to this, who've heard some of these things before, but haven't put them into practice.
Absolutely.
And it's courage. That's what it comes down to. And I think courage is so widely misunderstood. People say, oh, if only I had more courage, this would be easier for me.
Mm.
But the interpretation of that is that I would not be afraid if I had more courage.
Correct.
But that's actually not what courage is.
Mm.
Courage is a willingness to act even if you're afraid, even when you're afraid.
Right.
And so it's going to feel uncomfortable. And I think that's where people get so misunderstand this idea of courage. It's, oh my goodness, this is wildly uncomfortable. And I'm going to do it because it matters to me. And so one of the ways I help encourage people to find that willingness is number one is to help remind them of what does matter to them. What is their goal? What does success look like?
Yeah.
So that they can pursue that. And number two, be a champion for them, to be that person supporting them and encouraging them and helping them to find a willingness to move forward towards what counts.
Well said. And a follow-up question for you would be then, how do you help leaders overcome the fear of failure? Because, you need courage. People like status quo, or people like status quo anti. And people are, as you've said very rightly, people are afraid to, have or demonstrate courage or even say no. How do you help leaders overcome the fear of failure or rejection when pushing against corporate norms?
Mm-hmm. I have one of my favorite tools I'll share with you and share with all the listeners here is also relatively simple, but it's to zoom out.
Yeah.
When we're facing a challenging situations, let's just use an example of giving your boss feedback, telling your boss something that you disagree with or you don't like about the way they're acting. You tell most people to do that and they're going to say, no way. There's no way I'm going to go give my boss feedback. So let's say, what does it take to get there? So this is the idea of zooming out, because we get so hyper-focused on that one interaction and what is going to happen in the interaction. But if you zoom out a little bit, you say, oh, wow, well, I actually have a relationship with my boss. And we've worked together for 2 years or 10 years or whatever it is. And we've had many, many interactions. This is just one of many. And if you continue to zoom out, you see, well, I've worked for other people besides just this boss, and I will work for other people in the future. And so even this one boss is not that important relative to all the people I've worked with. And you continue to zoom out in your career and until you see the whole arc of your career, which for some people is 30 or more years. And you say, wow, this is one interaction out of 30 years. How important is that? And if you zoom out even further and you consider the whole of your life and all the things that are important to you and in your life, you start to think, saying what I truly believe is more important than what happens in this interaction. And so this process of zooming out, because we get so focused on the risk that's right in front of us. And by the way, that's the way your brain is wired. You have 5 times more circuitry in your brain devoted towards detecting and mitigating risk than you do pursuing reward. So naturally, you're going to focus on the risk, but this zooming out process helps to put it in perspective and ultimately empowers a lot of people to say, what's important to me matters more than the risk of this one interaction.
Well said. There's a very old saying, which is that a turtle does not make progress till it sticks its neck out. And therefore, my question for you is, how do you help leaders handle the fear of taking risks and standing out in a corporate environment?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes back to this, some of the principles that I've shared already with this process of zooming out. But more importantly is keeping in focus, who do you want to be and what really matters to you? And I'll tell you that the people who are a good fit for me between a coach and a client are not the people who want promotion at all costs and are ruthless and all they want is money and status. Those are not going to be the best fit for me. But the people that I really enjoy working with and we have a good relationship and help them to achieve their goals are people who have a bit of a broader perspective of life and what's important to them. And helping them to keep that in focus, to remember, actually give them permission and to validate what it is that they want.
Yeah.
I'll give you just a short anecdote around
Yeah.
that. As
Yeah.
I remember,
Please.
so I'm a Gen X,
Uh-huh.
so I've been in the workforce for a number of years, and I remember talking to another Gen X person who
Mm.
was commenting, saying, these Gen Z people just feel so entitled. They want all this time off and they want work-life balance. I mean, just get to work. That's what we did. And my reaction to that was, yes, that is what we did, but don't we also want meaningful work and a
Correct.
reasonable work-life balance? We just never felt empowered to ask for it.
Correct.
And so some of the work that I do with my clients is give them permission to say, it's great to want what you want. That's a
Mm.
good thing.
Well said.
And you don't necessarily have to go get permission to do this. You can be proactive in shaping your job,
Mm.
making decisions, bringing decisions to your boss instead of
Mm.
asking for permission. There's
Mm.
so many things that you can do, taking accountability for
Mm.
achieving what it is that you want.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the direction I like
I
to
love I
take my
love the example of the Gen X. Absolutely. I'm a boomer. So
okay.
that is 2 decades before you. But
Yeah.
time for two more questions, Rusty. Can you share your thoughts on how leaders can better align their personal values and their professional roles? I've often heard people say that, I have these personal values, but my work wants me to do something different.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things to consider here. Number one is most people have way more ability to shape their work than they take advantage of.
Right.
And so they just assume these are the job responsibilities I have. This is what's expected of me. And they just fit themselves into the box.
Mm.
Some of the work I do with my clients is to help shape the box. Say, well, what are you really good at? What do you like
Mm.
doing? What would you want to spend more time at? What are your values?
Yeah.
How can you bring more of that into your work? I
Mm.
want to just briefly go back to this example of Steve that I've talked
Mm.
about a few times.
Yeah.
One of the things Steve was very passionate about was mentoring other people and developing them in his field.
Mm.
And so we worked on how do you do more of that in your work? This was not part of his core job responsibility, but he loved doing it. And there
Mm.
was an opportunity to do that at work. And so we worked on bringing more of that in. So that's an example of shaping your job.
Mm.
Now, I will also acknowledge that there are legitimately some situations where the
Mm.
values of the company are misaligned with the values of the person.
Mm.
And in that
Yes.
case, I think it's making the realization and being willing to make the courageous and difficult decision to say this
Mhm.
is not the right place for me
Mm.
and change. But I
Mm.
think that that's tends to be a little bit more of the exception.
Mhm.
Many more people blame the external when they could take responsibility themselves and make changes.
Amazing. Wonderful response. Man, my last question for you, Rusty, what do you believe is the future of leadership in today's new world? And how do you prepare leaders for it when you coach them?
Yeah. I really believe that, especially as you think about AI, so
Mm.
much of the work can and will be automated and or at least AI assisted in some way. And so it's going to be this augmented intelligence kind of role, which puts more and more of a premium on people and the way we work together and the relationships and our ability to form a team and a productive culture.
Mm.
That's a very people-oriented approach.
Yeah.
And leaders, I believe, have to be people-oriented.
Mm.
And this again is a mindset shift because most
Mm.
leaders have become successful by delivering results.
Mm.
That's great,
Mm.
but the more you advance as a leader, the more your job is about the team. You're not delivering results, your
Yeah.
team is delivering results. And so you have to be really effective as a leader.
Mm.
And one of the ways that I help my clients position themselves for that is to find their voice, to be their best self, to be authentic, to
Mm.
bring their values into work, to be honest with people, to have those candid conversations. Because if you think about in real life outside of work, who are the best relationships you have? They're the
Mm.
people you know, you trust, you're honest with each other, you've got respect for each other.
Mm.
You you feel like you know the person on the other side.
Mm.
And that's what I help my leaders do is bring more
Mm.
of themselves to work so that they are known and they can bring their best ideas. They're happier, the team knows them and trusts them and builds a better relationship. And they're setting themselves up for this kind of people-oriented leadership that I believe is the wave of the future.
Amazing. And on that note, Rusty, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. I just love the way you integrated all the learnings from Apple and your earlier avatar as a rocket scientist into how it has evolved into a coaching. Thank you for speaking to me about many, many different aspects of coaching. I love the way you brought Steve in to give an example of three, four different questions that I asked you. And I've always said anecdotes, examples always stick much better in people's minds than just a dialogue. Thank you for that. We also spoke a lot about overcoming failure, taking risks. And thank you for telling me about your thoughts on the future of leadership. Thank you again and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. I appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.